Poor. Is that really all you think I am? The words cut through the room like a blade, spoken in the middle of what should have been a moment of celebration. In that instant, humiliation burned deeper than the champagne, and betrayal revealed itself in front of everyone. Sometimes, it takes just one careless insult to shatter illusions, to expose the truth behind polished smiles, and to force a reckoning no one saw coming. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Clifford Morgan, though most people just call me Cliff. At 62, I've grown used to living quietly, away from the bustle of the career that once defined me. I used to run a small but respected aerospace tooling company in Savannah, Georgia, a place that produced precision components for aircraft manufacturers. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it provided hundreds of paychecks to families like mine. 4 years ago, I sold the company, and after taxes and conservative investing, I walked away with $33 million. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt hollow. My wife, Emily, had died the year before from cancer, and without her, the money seemed less like a reward and more like an anchor. Since then, I've lived simply on Tybee Island in a modest one-bedroom condo overlooking the water. My neighbors think of me as the quiet widower who fishes at sunrise. I drive a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with peeling paint. My wardrobe consists of flannel shirts from outlet stores, boots scuffed from years of use, and the kind of jeans that never look new no matter how often you wash them. On the weekends, I take out my small skiff and let the tide carry me until the sun burns hot on the horizon. It's a humble life, deliberately so, because I wanted to see how people treated me when they assumed I had nothing left to offer. My daughter Lydia believes that her father survives on Social Security and a little savings. She's 29 now, a nurse practitioner who's worked hard to build a life in Charleston. Her heart is tender, her smile easy, and she carries herself with the kind of natural compassion that made her mother extraordinary. She calls often, worries when I sound tired, and always tells me not to stretch myself too thin. I let her believe I'm scraping by because it seemed easier than burdening her with the truth. She thinks she knows my world, but she doesn't know about the trust accounts, the investments, or the fact that I could buy her a house outright if I chose. Lydia is engaged to Brandon Keller, a Charleston restaurateur with glossy hair, perfect teeth, and a knack for making people feel small while pretending to flatter them. He's 32, charming on the surface, ambitious to the point of obsession, and backed by a family with deep Southern roots. Old money drips from his parents' accent and their tailored clothes. They sip bourbon like it's medicine, tell stories about ancestors who fought in wars, and glance at me like I'm the help. To them, my thrift store jacket is proof of failure, not choice. To Brandon, I am the embarrassing in-law he'd rather keep out of sight. The wedding is set at a plantation-turned-event venue outside Charleston. Spanish moss drapes from the trees, white columns stretch into the sky, and the rental price for the weekend could buy a small fishing business. The contrast is sharp. Brandon's family hosts garden parties with violinists, while my people prefer potlucks and barbecue pits. I don't begrudge them their taste for luxury, but every invitation, every planning detail seems designed to remind me that I don't belong in their world. Still, Lydia loves Brandon. She defends him when he makes sly jokes at my expense, insisting that he's nervous or tired. She believes in him the way only a woman in love can believe in a man's potential. I want to believe too, for her sake. A father wants his daughter to be happy, and sometimes we try to look past the warning signs because we hope love will smooth out the edges. But there's a difference between rough edges and sharp blades, and I can't shake the feeling that Brandon's edges cut deep. To guard the truth, I rely on my old friend and attorney, Ruth Caldwell. She's kept the trust airtight, the documents sealed, and a letter in her office safe, with instructions if anything should happen to me. Ruth has seen me through the best and worst seasons of life. and she knows why I hide what I hide. She also knows that money reveals as much about people as it tempts them. Her advice has always been the same: watch, wait, and when the time comes, act decisively. The night before the wedding, I sit through the rehearsal dinner at a long wooden table lined with silverware polished to a blinding shine. Brandon raises a glass and makes a toast that draws polite laughter, a joke about humble beginnings that lands like a dart aimed at my chest. His parents beam with pride while my hands curl in my lap. Lydia squeezes my fingers beneath the tablecloth, silently begging me not to take offense. I smile for her, but inside, something shifts. I look around at the candlelit room, at the distance between my world and theirs, and I realize that tomorrow will test more than just my daughter's vows. It will test my own role as her father, and whether silence is the same as love, or whether silence has already cost too much. If you're still watching and want to know how a simple family gathering turned into a storm of betrayal, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move into the first cracks that began to show. The first signs came at the tasting, when the caterer asked which side of the family would be covering final balances. Brandon smiled with that slick confidence of his and tapped his glass with a fork before answering. "We're a little cash flow constrained on the bride's side," he said, nodding toward me. The words slid out like a joke, but I caught the ripple of laughter from a few nearby guests. My daughter, Lydia, flushed with embarrassment, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. I had learned long ago that silence often reveals more about people than words do. Later, when I offered to help set up chairs, Brandon cut me off with a pat on the shoulder. "We've got staff for that, sir," he said loud enough for others to hear. Then he leaned toward Lydia and whispered, though I could still catch it, "Working hands don't look good in pictures." Lydia stiffened, but she said nothing. My chest tightened. I had carried steel beams on my back when I was his age, worked shifts that ran from dawn to dusk, and paid mortgages with sweat and sore muscles. To him, those hands were nothing but props unworthy of the glossy image he was selling. A few minutes later, he handed me a stack of papers with a half smile. "Just a customary cosign for a vendor loan," he explained, waving off the fine print. "Everyone does it." I leafed through quickly, spotting interest rates and repayment terms that had no business involving me. "I'll pass," I said evenly, handing the pages back. He shrugged and muttered, "Of course." Tight budgets, making sure 2 groomsmen heard it. They exchanged a grin like they'd just witnessed a private joke at my expense. That evening at the rehearsal dinner, under strings of lights and polished silverware, Brandon raised his glass in a toast. "Here's to humble beginnings," he announced, glancing directly at my thrift store jacket. The laugh that followed wasn't hearty. It was polite, strained, the kind people use when they're not sure if it's safe to laugh. Lydia's hand found mine under the table, her fingers pressing gently, begging me not to react. I kept my expression neutral, but inside something cold settled in my gut. When the speeches ended and the band played soft jazz, I slipped outside onto the veranda. The Charleston air was thick, heavy with salt and magnolia. I dialed Ruth Caldwell, my attorney and the one person who knew the truth. She answered on the second ring. "Ruth," I said, keeping my voice low, "if he humiliates me publicly tomorrow, we move forward with the plan." Her tone was steady, calm as stone. "Your way is lawful, measured, and final. If it comes to that, text me one word: go." I nodded to myself, though she couldn't see it. "Thank you." "Remember," she added, "this isn't about revenge. It's about protection." Back in my condo that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of heavy paper. I wrote to Lydia, pouring out the truths I had never spoken aloud. I told her about the first time I saw her mother smile across a church picnic, about the way we built our life brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. I wrote about how money can dress a man in silk, but cannot give him character. I warned her that choosing a partner who confuses status with love is like building a house on sand. It may look strong, but it cannot stand against the tide. When I finished, I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. If tomorrow brought storm clouds, this letter would be my daughter's compass. Outside, the tide slapped against the dock pilings, sharp and insistent. Nature seemed to echo my unease, a reminder that storms build quietly before they break open. I thought of Emily then, how she used to insist I wear my old boots even when I wanted to throw them out. "They make you walk honest," she'd say with a grin. At sunrise, I laced those boots once more, the leather worn soft but still holding. I looked at myself in the mirror, a man others thought was poor, a man my future son-in-law mocked openly, a man my daughter still trusted. Tomorrow might give me a son, or it might force me to show my daughter what kind of man she was about to marry. Either way, the tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. If you're still watching and curious about the subtle signs that hinted at something darker beneath the smiles, comment number 2 below so I know you're following along. Now, let's step into the moment where tension truly begins. The morning of the wedding broke clear and hot, with sunlight streaming through Spanish moss that draped over the oaks. Guests arrived in pastel dresses and tailored suits, their voices carrying across the plantation lawn like music. To anyone else, it might have looked like a perfect Southern celebration. To me, it felt like walking into a theater where I already knew the script and my role had been cut to a few quiet lines. An usher with a stiff smile guided me away from the first rows reserved for family and escorted me toward the side aisle, 4th seat from the back. A column blocked part of the view. He offered a polite explanation about logistics and spacing, but I knew better. The bride's father traditionally sat up front, close enough to watch every step, every tear. Instead, I was positioned as if I were a distant cousin, hidden in plain sight. I lowered myself into the chair, jaw tight, forcing my breath to remain steady. The photographer bustled about, calling for groups. I heard him ask if the father of the bride was ready to be included. Before I could rise, Brandon waved him off. "Let's get the clean set first," he said, gesturing to Lydia and her attendants. The words stung. A clean set. No worn jackets, no old boots, no reminders that Lydia came from humbler roots. He looked at me then, smiling faintly, and pressed an umbrella into my hands. "Hold this for Lydia," he said, his voice smooth. "We don't want her makeup smudging." So, there I stood, shaded by the umbrella I held over my daughter's radiant face, present but excluded from the picture that would outlast us all. When the ceremony began, the music swelled, and Lydia walked down the aisle with grace that took my breath away. For a moment, pride drowned everything else. She looked like her mother, Emily, strong and full of light. I watched with tears gathering at the corners of my eyes, hidden behind the column that blocked half my view. The vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto trembling fingers, and the guests applauded. I clapped too, but the sound was muffled, as though my hands knew I was applauding from the shadows. Afterward, guests mingled under white tents for cocktail hour. Trays of champagne and oysters passed through the crowd, and laughter bubbled across the lawn. I made my way to the oyster bar, searching for a moment of quiet in the noise. That was when Brandon appeared, bourbon in hand, his tie loosened just enough to suggest effortless ease. He leaned in close, voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Cliff, do you even have a card we can put incidentals on? No shame if not." I answered evenly. "I brought cash for tips." He grinned, broad and sharp. "Cash, of course." He raised his glass, repeating the word, so the people around us chuckled. It was the laugh of people who didn't know the whole story, but enjoyed the performance anyway. Brandon wasn't finished. He tapped his glass, calling for attention. "To old trucks and older wallets," he said, lifting his drink toward me. The crowd chuckled again, some polite, some genuine. My cheeks burned, though I kept my face still. Lydia's eyes darted to mine across the lawn. She looked stricken, torn between loyalty to me and her fear of disrupting the day she had built. I felt the storm gather in my chest, the same way it had years ago, when a supplier tried to cheat my machinists out of hazard pay. My silence then had nearly cost them their safety. My silence now was costing Lydia her dignity. I pulled out my phone beneath the table where I had settled, thumb hovering only a moment. Then I typed 3 letters and pressed in NGO. The message flew across the quiet digital sky to Ruth, the attorney who had prepared for this very moment. My part was simple, Observe, endure, and when the humiliation crossed the line, give the signal. I had given it. The wheels were now turning, though no one around me knew. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, outwardly calm, inwardly steadying myself for the storm I had just unleashed. Lydia mouthed across the crowd, "You okay?" I nodded once, slow and deliberate. She deserved a father who wouldn't flinch. The tide had turned, and Brandon had no idea it was already sweeping in. If you're still watching and can feel how the first wound cut deeper than anyone expected, drop a number 3 in the comments. Now, let's uncover how that first betrayal set the stage for everything that followed. After sending Ruth the signal, I told myself I would give Brandon one last chance. Maybe he had been nervous. Maybe the bourbon loosened his tongue too much. My daughter loved him, and for her sake I had to be sure I'd tried everything before pulling the floor out from under him. During a lull between the cocktail hour and the reception, I found him near the garden path, away from most of the guests. The lanterns along the walkway flickered, throwing light across his polished shoes. "Brandon," I said quietly, keeping my tone steady, "I want a word." He turned with a smirk that told me he thought I was about to apologize. Instead, I spoke plainly. "I've built things in my life. Businesses, scholarships, opportunities for people who needed a hand. I'm prepared to help you and Lydia, maybe a small business grant to ease your start, so long as you treat her as your partner, not your prop." He laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "A grant? That's adorable, Cliff. We're raising real money. Investors, expansion, capital, not pocket change." I felt the sting but stood my ground. Respect and transparency matter more than numbers on a page. He stretched, yawning as if bored. "Some men just age into bitterness. You're a sweet man with limited means, but don't confuse that with wisdom." Then, as if to punctuate the insult, he called Lydia over. She approached, smiling uncertainly. He kissed her forehead and added, "Your father means well, honey. He just worries because he can't provide." Her face tightened, caught between loyalty to me and the man she thought she loved. I wanted to shout, to tear away the mask he wore, but I kept still. Outrage was the weapon he expected. Calm would unsettle him more. I turned without a word and walked toward the main house. Inside, I found the venue office where Avery, the manager, sat reviewing checklists. He was a sturdy man with the posture of someone who had served, and I could tell by his steady gaze he had noticed Brandon's arrogance. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked. "Just need to prepare a surprise slideshow for my daughter," I said. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. Avery unlocked the laptop and left me alone. I opened a folder Ruth had helped prepare. The first images were simple, photos of machinists in my old factory, men and women hunched over laths and welders, faces lit by sparks. Then came pictures of scholarship recipients, young people holding certificates funded quietly through my foundation. Finally, slides of figures, the trust, the assets, the security I had built. Proof of a life Brandon dismissed as worthless. I queued the deck, then logged into the vendor portal. A line of invoices appeared. Catering, music, floral. With a single button, Ruth had arranged for payments to be released and liens cleared. I hovered my finger over the key but didn't press it yet. Timing would matter. Avery returned to check in. He glanced at the slides, then at my face. "Sir, whatever storm you're walking into, remember this. Don't pick a fist fight. Pick a paper one. Paper cuts deeper and lasts longer." I nodded. He was right. Words could be denied. Anger brushed off. But paper, contracts, transfers, signatures, those left trails no one could erase. I closed the laptop and pulled out the letter I had written to Lydia. The envelope felt heavy in my pocket, though it weighed almost nothing. Inside were truths about her mother, about dignity, about the cost of mistaking wealth for love. I touched it as a reminder that this was not about revenge, no matter how much my pride wanted it to be. This was about protecting my daughter from a man who had already shown her what she meant to him. Leverage, not love. When I stepped back into the reception hall, the band had started to play Stand By Me. Guests swayed with glasses in hand, their laughter echoing against the high ceiling. My old boots struck the polished floor, each step measured and steady. To anyone watching, I was just the quiet father of the bride returning from a break. But inside, I knew the performance was almost over. The real fight was about to begin, and this time it would be fought with documents, not fists, with truths that no amount of charm could bury. If you're still watching and wondering whether the first attempts to make peace could succeed, comment number 4 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's see why every effort only made the conflict grow sharper. The reception hall glowed with candlelight, the tables dressed in white linen and gold trim. The band played soft jazz while servers carried trays of wine and champagne. Guests laughed easily, lulled by the beauty of the evening, but my chest felt tight. I had spent the day swallowing insults, sitting behind pillars, watching my role as father shrink to nothing. Now the toasts began, and I could feel the air shifting towards something combustible. Brandon was first to stand, his tuxedo jacket undone, glass raised high. The bourbon on his breath carried across the microphone. "I want to thank everyone who made this day possible," he said, smiling at the front rows. Then his eyes slid toward me, his grin sharpening. "And of course, to those who tried to help. Real men don't measure love in pocket change." Laughter rolled through the room, some genuine, some awkward. I sat still, my jaw clenched. He invited a few of his restaurant partners up to say a few words. They were young men in tailored suits, speaking loudly as though the entire evening were their audition. One joked about upgrading the Morgan brand, gesturing toward Lydia with a wink that turned my stomach. Another lifted his glass and shouted, "To bigger deals and bigger checks!" The guests chuckled politely, but I saw Lydia's smile flicker, her eyes darting nervously toward me. Brandon took the mic again, emboldened by his friends' jeers. "To wives who marry for love and husbands who carry the bill, no offense, Cliff." The laughter that followed was sharper this time, carrying the unmistakable edge of cruelty. I watched my daughter's face crumple for the briefest second before she forced her lips into a smile. That was the moment I stood. My chair scraped against the floor, a sound that cut through the laughter. The band quieted and heads turned. I lifted a hand, asking gently, "May I say a few words?" Brandon groaned theatrically. "Sure, open mic night," he said, clapping me on the back. His hand lingered too long, heavy with mockery. "Keep it short, old-timer." I walked to the microphone, my boots sounding louder than they should have against the polished floor. I took a moment, looking at the faces in the room, family friends, Lydia's colleagues, Brandon's investors. My daughter sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes wide with silent pleading. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Lydia and Brandon. As her father, nothing makes me prouder than seeing my daughter loved and supported." A polite wave of applause passed through the hall. I nodded slowly, then added, "I'd like to offer a small gift in their honor." The crowd leaned in, expectant. Brandon, sensing the moment slipping, grabbed the mic halfway. "Cash bar in the foyer, folks," he joked loudly. "Cliff's got his cash." Laughter broke out again, but this time it was uneasy, scattered. People were starting to notice the edge in his tone. I didn't flinch. I waited for the laughter to die, then looked directly at my daughter. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. My hand gripped the microphone tighter. The choice I had been circling for months now stood in front of me. Enough pretending, enough silence. The air in the hall seemed to grow heavier, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. Guests leaned forward, forks stilled above plates. Even the band sat quietly, instruments resting in their laps. Inside me, the storm finally broke its banks. I had been content to play the humble father, to sit quietly behind pillars and smile at condescension, but no longer. Tonight, before 200 witnesses, I would strip away every layer Brandon had wrapped himself in. I would not do it with fists or shouts. I would do it with the one weapon no one in that room expected me to wield: the truth. I drew in a slow breath, my eyes never leaving Lydia's. The words lined up inside me, sharp as blades. For the first time that night, Brandon's smirk faltered. He could sense it too. The room had shifted. Something was about to be revealed. and no amount of charm would cover it. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said quietly, "you deserve to know who you're really celebrating." The room went utterly still after my words. Candle flames flickered as if even the air itself had stopped moving. Forks hovered above plates, and 200 sets of eyes fixed on me. Brandon shifted at the head table, his face tightening into a smirk that no longer looked confident. It looked brittle. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black remote Avery had slipped me. One click, and the projection screen at the far end of the hall hummed to life. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the first image appeared, a black and white photograph of the factory floor where I had spent most of my working life. Rows of machinists stood over lathes and drill presses, sparks flying like constellations. Another click showed scholarship recipients, teenagers in caps and gowns, holding certificates that bore my company's seal. Their smiles filled the room with a truth money could not disguise. "This," I said, my voice low but steady, "was my life's work. A company I built from the ground up. 4 years ago, I sold it. I put the proceeds into a trust." I paused before continuing. "That trust is worth $33 million. The room gasped as one. Glasses clinked against tables, chairs scraped, voices whispered in shock. Brandon shot to his feet. "This is a stunt," he barked. "None of it's real. He's broke." Another click. Numbers appeared. Bank statements, account balances, Wells Fargo private banking header visible at the top. I had blurred the personal identifiers, but the figures were clear enough. $33 million and change. "These are the accounts," I said. "Verified, documented, real." A low buzz swept across the room. Brandon's restaurant partners leaned toward each other, whispering sharply. I saw one man's jaw tighten, the color rising in his face. But I wasn't finished. Another slide appeared, this time showing scanned invoices. "And then there are these," I continued. "Vendor invoices connected to Brandon's LLC, forged numbers, inflated costs, money skimmed off contracts tied to this very wedding." Gasps turned into angry murmurs. The investors who had laughed earlier now stared at Brandon with narrowed eyes. Lydia covered her mouth with her hands, disbelief washing across her features. Brandon lunged for the remote, his voice harsh. "He's lying. He's jealous. He's poor and desperate." The word poor echoed through the microphone, bouncing across the walls. Guests flinched. The insult, once laughed at, now landed like a slap. I didn't move. I clicked again. The screen now showed confirmation emails of wire transfers made that afternoon. Scholarships funded at Georgia Tech. Donations wired to children's hospitals in Savannah and Charleston. Each line item bore a date, a timestamp, and an amount that left the audience gasping again. "This is what I choose to do with my money," I said. "To give opportunities, to heal, to build, not to mock and not to humiliate." Brandon shouted, but the microphone picked up nothing. I had already switched it off for him. The only voice in the room was mine. Then came the moment I had been building toward. I turned to Lydia, my daughter in her ivory gown, her eyes wet with confusion. "Lydia," I said softly, "the remainder of that trust, $33 million, sits in your future, but it will not be unconditional." The screen shifted again, this time to a single page titled Ethics Agreement. "You and your husband can access it only if you both sign this. It requires financial transparency, honesty in all contracts, and joint consent on major decisions. If you do not, the funds revert to charity within 12 months. The words settled over the crowd like heavy stone. Some guests nodded in approval, others whispered nervously. Lydia's breath caught. She looked at Brandon, then at me. "This is not about money," I said, my voice quieter now but sharper. "It's about character. About the life you choose to build and the truth you choose to stand on." I set the microphone down gently. "This is your choice, not mine." The hall was silent. Even the band sat frozen, instruments untouched. Lydia's fingers trembled against her bouquet. Brandon's jaw worked furiously, but for once, words seemed to fail him. The music had stopped. The laughter was gone. The only sound left in the room was the heavy weight of decision pressing down on bride and groom alike. If you're still watching and ready to witness the moment when everything hangs by a single decision, drop number 5 in the comments to stay with me. Now, let's reveal the choice that changed everything. The moment I set down the microphone, the hall broke into uneasy whispers. Some guests clapped politely, others stared at the floor, and more than a few glanced toward the exits as if considering a quiet escape. The illusion of Brandon's smooth charm, carefully polished for months, was gone. What remained was a man exposed, cornered, and desperate. Brandon tried to laugh, the sound high and brittle. "All right, folks, fun's over. My father-in-law's got a sense of humor, doesn't he?" He waved a hand toward the projection screen, but the tremor in his fingers betrayed him. "Numbers can be faked. Screenshots can be faked. Let's move on with the wedding." No one laughed. His voice cracked again as he added, "Come on, let's not ruin the evening over theatrics." From the front table, one of his restaurant partners rose sharply. "Is that true?" he demanded, pointing to the invoices still glowing on the screen. "These are our contracts." "Did you forge these numbers, Brandon?" Brandon's face flushed. "It's not what it looks like." Another partner stood. "You told us vendor costs doubled. You pocketed the difference, didn't you?" His voice was thick with fury. "You stole from us." The whispers in the room swelled into a low roar. Lydia looked around helplessly, clutching her bouquet like it was the only solid thing left. I saw the heartbreak on her face, the realization creeping in. She had promised herself to a man whose mask had cracked in front of everyone she loved. Guests began excusing themselves quietly, the scrape of chairs cutting through the tension. A few made polite excuses, long drive, early morning, but their faces were tight with disapproval. Others stayed, transfixed, unwilling to miss the spectacle unraveling before them. Brandon's mother stood, her pearls trembling against her neck. "Sweetheart, sit down," she urged, voice brittle. "We can handle this privately." But his father, red-faced and stone-hard, cut her off. "Reckless boy. You've embarrassed this family." The words carried across the hall like a verdict. Brandon spun toward me, eyes blazing. "This is your doing, old man. You couldn't stand to see me succeed, so you dug up lies to ruin me." I didn't answer. I simply sat at my table, hands folded, letting his fury burn itself out. My silence was louder than his rage. The journalist from the Charleston Post and Courier, seated 2 tables away, scribbled furiously in her notebook. She raised her phone, snapping photo after photo. I caught her eye briefly, and she gave me the smallest of nods. I knew then this night would never be contained to the walls of this plantation hall. By morning, the city would be buzzing. By afternoon, perhaps the country. Through it all, Lydia's struggle was plain. Tears welled in her eyes, but her jaw tightened. She looked from Brandon to me, from the broken mask of the man she had married to the steady presence of her father. Her wedding gown shimmered under the chandeliers, but the joy it had once represented was gone. She looked less like a bride and more like an actress who realized the play was over and the audience had seen the truth. Brandon's investors closed in. "You're finished with us," one hissed. "We'll be filing suit first thing Monday." Another shook his head with disgust and walked out, glass shattering as he dropped it into the nearest bin. Brandon turned, frantic now, to Lydia. "Tell him it doesn't matter," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Tell him we don't need his money." The hall fell silent again, every eye turning to the bride. The candles flickered, the music had long since died, and the only sound was the shallow breathing of 200 witnesses waiting for her answer. Lydia's lips trembled, her eyes wide and full of the storm raging inside her. For the first time that evening, she looked not like a woman caught between 2 men, but like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, forced to decide which path would save her and which would ruin her forever. The silence after Brandon's outburst was suffocating. Even the candles seemed to burn quieter, their flames shrinking in the still air. 200 guests watched Lydia, waiting for her response. She stood frozen, bouquet trembling in her hands, her breath uneven. In that moment, the weight of her new vows collided with the sudden knowledge that she had married a man who mocked, and lied without shame. Her voice came softly at first, but it carried across the hall. I never realized how cruel you could be, Brandon." Her words shook, but they were undeniable. "I didn't want to believe my father when he warned me. But now..." She trailed off, choking back tears. Brandon grabbed her arm quickly, pulling her toward him. His smile was gone, replaced by something darker. "Don't let him manipulate you," he hissed, his voice sharp enough for nearby guests to hear. "It's us against him. He's trying to control you, Lydia. Can't you see?" I rose slowly from my chair, careful not to escalate. "Lydia," I said gently, "you don't have to answer him. Not here, not now. You owe no one in this room an explanation. Only yourself." My tone was calm, steady, the opposite of Brandon's desperation. Guests shifted in their seats. A few nodded, their expressions soft with sympathy. The tide in the room had turned. Brandon's investors looked away, unwilling to defend him. Even his parents sat in silence, their disappointment hanging heavier than words. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope I had written the night before. I walked toward Lydia, the envelope resting lightly in my hand. When I reached her, I offered it quietly. "For later," I said, "when the noise is gone and you can think clearly." Her fingers closed around it, trembling. She pressed it to her chest as if it were a lifeline. I saw recognition in her eyes, the understanding that whatever lay inside was born of love, not leverage. Brandon sneered at the letter. "A bribe wrapped in sentiment," he spat. "That's all it is. He's dangling money to tear us apart." His bitterness poured into every word, exposing the resentment he had carried not just toward me, but toward Lydia too. She pulled her arm from his grip, her gown rustling like a flag snapping in the wind. For the first time that night, she straightened her back and faced him squarely. "If it were just about money, you wouldn't be so angry," she said, her voice stronger now. "Love shouldn't feel like a business deal. It shouldn't feel like a battlefield." The room murmured in agreement, soft voices blending into a current that carried her words further than she alone could have managed. Brandon looked around, realizing he stood alone, the crowd no longer charmed by his grin or his jokes. I watched, my heart heavy but steady. I had not wanted this for my daughter, not on what should have been her happiest day. But watching her pull away from him, watching her finally see what I had feared, brought me a quiet relief. Not victory, relief. I gave her the smallest nod, telling her without words that she was not alone, that whatever came next, she would not face it without me. My role was no longer to fight Brandon. It was to give Lydia space to see her own strength. The hall slowly began to empty. Guests whispered their goodbyes, some pressing Lydia's hand with compassion, others shaking my shoulder in silent support. A few lingered near the back, still curious, still unwilling to miss the final act of the evening. Brandon stormed toward the exit, his face twisted in fury. His parents followed reluctantly, their expressions strained with humiliation. The journalist tucked her notebook into her bag, her eyes already alight with the story she would write. When the doors closed behind them, Lydia remained standing alone in her wedding gown, the envelope pressed against her heart. The music was silent, the tables half abandoned, the air heavy with what had been lost. But in her posture, I saw something new, a spark of resolve, fragile but real. The battle was not finished, but the tide had shifted. My daughter was no longer blind to the man she had married, and I knew then that whatever path she chose, it would not be one walked in ignorance. If you're still watching and eager to see whether healing is even possible after so much pain, comment number 6 below, so I know you're with me. Now, let's explore the path toward resolution. The plantation hall had fallen silent. Hours earlier, it had pulsed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the chatter of 200 guests. Now, only a handful of candles burned low, their wax dripping into empty plates and half-drunk champagne flutes. The floor was littered with petals and napkins, signs of a celebration that had curdled into something far heavier. Lydia sat at a table near the front, her ivory gown pooled around her like a fading dream. In her hands rested the envelope I had given her. She stared at it as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. I stood a few feet away, giving her space. Every instinct in me wanted to tell her what to do, to shield her from the pain of choice, but I knew this had to be hers. She needed to read those words on her own terms, without my voice filling the silence. At last, she slid a finger under the seal and opened the envelope. The paper crackled softly as she unfolded it. My handwriting, uneven from years of use and calloused fingers, stretched across the page. She read silently, her lips moving slightly with each word. I watched her eyes glisten, the tears rising as the words sank in. Your mother taught me that love is measured in dignity, not dollars. She believed respect was the foundation of any home, and I have tried to honor that belief. Money can build houses, but it cannot build a family. Don't mistake polish for integrity, Lydia. Look for the man who will stand by you when the lights go out, not the one who shines when people are watching. Her shoulders shook. A tear slid down her cheek and fell onto the page. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath breaking. Then she turned to me, her voice cracking. Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought Brandon was stability. I thought he was strength. I didn't see. I moved to her side, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. Don't apologize, I said. You wanted love. That's nothing to be ashamed of. But love should never humiliate you. It should never make you feel small. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, as if it were something sacred. Then she leaned into me, and for the first time since Emily's passing, I felt the weight of fatherhood return in full. Not as a burden, but as a calling, to be her anchor when the world tried to sweep her away. Meanwhile, news of the evening was already spreading. Guests who had left early were sending messages. The Charleston Post and Courier journalist had her notes and photos, and Brandon's investors wasted no time in cutting ties. By morning, his name would be spoken with disgust in boardrooms and coffee shops alike. Lawsuits loomed, and his reputation, so carefully crafted, was unraveling thread by thread. Brandon's parents had slipped out earlier, his mother in tears, his father red-faced with rage. They would retreat to their estate, muttering about embarrassment and betrayal, but they would not shield him from the consequences. This time, he would stand alone. I turned back to Lydia, who was still clinging to my hand. You're not ruined, I told her softly. You're freed. A wedding isn't a prison. Annulments exist for a reason. You don't owe him your life because of one day's vows. Her tears slowed, her breathing steadier. A small group of her friends, nurses from her clinic, women she had studied with, gathered around her. They whispered comfort, offered tissues, and told her they would stand by her no matter what. The sight brought me a quiet relief. She still had a community beyond Brandon, people who saw her worth without calculation. At last, Lydia looked down at her left hand. The diamond sparkled faintly in the candlelight, mocking her with promises already broken. Slowly, deliberately, she slid the ring from her finger and set it on the table beside my letter. The small sound of metal against wood rang louder than any toast that night. This isn't the life I want, she whispered. The words were soft, but they were final. I closed my eyes, exhaling fully for the first time since the day began. My chest, heavy with worry, finally eased. She had chosen dignity over pretense, truth over lies. The storm had broken, and though the wreckage was real, she had survived it. The hall was nearly empty now. Staff moved quietly among the tables, gathering glasses and extinguishing candles. Beyond the tall windows, the first light of dawn stretched across the marshes, painting the horizon with pale gold. A new day had come, as if nature itself wanted to sweep away the ashes of the night. I reached for Lydia's hand, and she placed hers in mine, her grip steady despite the tremor in her body. Let's go home, I said gently. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Together we walked toward the doors, past the remnants of a wedding that had ended before it began. The petals crunched under my boots, and Lydia's gown trailed across the floor, like the closing curtain of a play. Outside, the air was cool and sharp with the scent of salt from the marsh. The sky was clearing, and I thought of Emily again, her laughter, her strength, the lessons she had left behind. I imagined her watching from somewhere unseen, proud that Lydia had found her voice, proud that I had found the courage to defend it. As we stepped into the dawn, I knew one chapter of our lives had ended, but another, stronger, freer, built on truth, was only just beginning. Weeks passed before the sting of that night dulled, though its echoes still lived in every headline, every whispered conversation in Charleston's coffee shops. I would walk down the street and catch glances from strangers, some sympathetic, others curious, but all carrying the weight of recognition. The story had spread far beyond the plantation hall. Brandon's name was printed in bold across newspapers. Local entrepreneur sued for fraud. His photographs appeared under words like disgraced and arrogant. The empire he boasted of was crumbling brick by brick. His investors filed lawsuits, his restaurants faced closures, and his social circle thinned until only shadows remained. Lydia, meanwhile, took her own path to healing. Within 3 weeks, she filed for an annulment, a decision made with trembling hands but steady conviction. She began therapy, sometimes calling me after sessions to cry, other times to share small victories, like realizing she could laugh again without guilt. Her friends stayed close, filling her evenings with companionship and reminders that she was more than the mistakes she had made. Slowly, the color returned to her cheeks, and the nervous way she looked over her shoulder faded. I watched her step back into her work at the clinic with a new sense of purpose. She told me once, during a walk along the marsh, "I want my future defined by what I do, not by who I married." Those words reminded me so much of her mother, practical, fierce, and quietly brave. Emily would have been proud. As for me, I found myself busier than I expected. The events of that night thrust me into a spotlight I had avoided for years. People reached out, not because of the money, but because of the message. They wanted me to speak at schools, at community centers, even at church gatherings. They wanted to hear how dignity could outlast deceit. At first I resisted, thinking myself too ordinary to offer wisdom. But then I remembered Avery's words in the venue office. Pick a paper fight, not a fist fight. Sometimes the paper was a ledger, other times it was a speech that carried truth. I began donating more intentionally. A scholarship fund in Emily's name for nursing students, grants for local machine shops that hired veterans, a new wing at the children's hospital, quiet and unassuming, but desperately needed. Each act reminded me that wealth is a tool, not a trophy. Through it all, Lydia and I grew closer. Our walks by the marsh became a ritual. We would watch the tide roll in, talking about Emily, about resilience, and about the traps people fall into when dazzled by polish over substance. One evening, Lydia stopped mid-walk and looked at me. "Thank you," she said, her eyes wet but steady. Not for the money, not even for the letter. For loving me enough to let me see for myself. I placed my hand over hers and answered, "That's what parents are for. Not to shield you from every mistake, but to stand beside you when the world shows its teeth." Looking back, I realized something that night on the plantation had taught me. I had always feared my fortune would poison relationships. I kept it hidden, thinking secrecy was the only way to know who truly cared. But I learned that money doesn't change character, it reveals it. What people do when they think you're poor says more about them than what they do when they know you're wealthy. That became my message. In every speech, I told the story without embellishment, letting people draw their own lessons. I reminded them that betrayal often hides behind smiles, but truth, once uncovered, cannot be buried again. On a quiet evening months later, I sat on my porch with a glass of sweet tea. The marsh spread out before me. The tide was rolling in, slow and steady, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. Lydia joined me, her steps light, her smile genuine for the first time in months. We didn't need to speak much. The silence between us was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, filled with understanding. I thought of Emily then, as I often did. I whispered inwardly that our daughter had found her strength, that she had chosen dignity over illusion. I hoped she could hear me somehow. As the sun sank low, painting the sky in strokes of gold and violet, I turned to Lydia and said, "Fortune fades, but character does not. That is the inheritance I hope you carry forward, she nodded. And in her eyes, I saw the promise of a future not defined by wealth or wounds, but by the unshakable strength of truth. In the quiet aftermath of betrayal and revelation, what remains is not the spectacle of downfall, but the lessons carved into the fabric of human experience. Life has a way of stripping away illusions, exposing not just the faults of others, but the resilience within ourselves. The measure of a life is rarely found in the numbers etched in bank accounts or the grandeur of public ceremonies. It is found in the integrity carried when no one else is watching. True wealth is never money. It is dignity, character, and the courage to stand by them when tested. Every human being will encounter moments where the mask of another slips, revealing cruelty, indifference, or greed. These moments are painful, but they are also clarifying. They remind us that the world does not bend to appearances. The polished surface of charm or success can be nothing more than a thin veneer hiding selfish ambition. When it cracks, as it inevitably does, the truth floods out. And in that truth, people must decide whether to cling to illusion or walk in honesty. The choice is never easy, but it is always defining. Betrayal, for all its sting, carries a paradoxical gift. It shows us who we are. In the face of humiliation, one can respond with bitterness or with resolve. Humiliation tempts us toward anger, but resolve teaches us that the cruelty of others cannot strip away our worth unless we allow it. The heart learns strength not by avoiding wounds, but by finding the courage to heal without hardening. To emerge with compassion intact is the quiet victory that no betrayal can erase. There is also a deeper truth about power. Wealth, reputation, or influence cannot grant virtue. They can amplify what is already within. A generous heart will use resources to build, to uplift, to heal. A selfish heart will use the same tools to dominate, to belittle, to wound. The contrast between these paths is what gives wealth its dual edge. It is not inherently good or evil. It is a mirror. It reflects back the essence of its keeper, and that reflection cannot be hidden forever. Love, too, demands examination. Genuine love cannot coexist with humiliation. To love is to protect, to respect, and to see another not as leverage but as a soul. The absence of respect, no matter how finely dressed, is still absence. Love that is conditional upon wealth, status, or appearances is not love at all. It is arrangement, transaction, illusion. Real love withstands difficulty, even poverty, because it is rooted not in what someone possesses, but in who they are. When we fail to remember this, we open the door to disappointment that feels like betrayal. The story of dignity rising from insult is older than any single family or single moment. Across time, people have learned and relearned that what others call us matters less than what we choose to answer to. Words like poor, weak, or unworthy can bruise, but they do not define. Character defines. The quiet persistence of truth defines. In the end, the world remembers not the shine of a wedding, the grandeur of a speech, or even the fortune revealed, but the moral clarity that stands when the noise fades. Perhaps the greatest inheritance any person can leave is not property, not gold, not trust accounts, but the lesson that character is the only currency that never loses value. Fortunes can crumble, reputations can falter, but a life built on respect and dignity endures. That endurance becomes a compass for those who follow, guiding them through their own storms with the reminder that honesty outlasts deceit, that humility defeats arrogance, and that compassion is stronger than cruelty. When the lights dim and the guests depart, what remains is not the echo of applause or laughter, but the quiet reckoning of choices. And in that reckoning lies freedom. Freedom to step away from illusion, freedom to claim dignity, freedom to begin again without shame. That is the lasting truth. Fortune fades, but character does not. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, Feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.